Welcome to PAATHHistory. Today we are going to discuss about the origins of Italian Renaissance. The Renaissance as a movement was the product of an urban environment. Italian city-states were the most urbanized centers of Europe. The Renaissance culture was the product of an interesting and curious world of Italian city-states, in that the revival of the ancient world and its application to the present society came to reflect the civic needs of that time. The most common question raised is, why did the Renaissance flourish in Italy? The Renaissance in Italy sprang from the urban environment that existed in the cities of northern and central Italy. The principal social groups, particularly in Florence, consisted of three categories. At the top of the social strata were the richest men, called by various names like nobili, principali, grandi, or the first citizens, who monopolized political power and kept all the principal official posts with themselves. Members of this group were well educated, widely traveled, experienced, and lived magnificent houses in the heart of the city. Below the nobili was the category of mezzani or popolari, who were men of moderate means and were shopkeepers, bakers, wine sellers, druggists, artists, lawyers, notaries, civil servants, and teachers. The upper section of the society brought about the Renaissance, and quite often the wealth was provided by the second category. The connection of wealth in the Italian cities and their very active civil life created a more worldly view of life. The presence of many self-governing city-states prompted them to culturally and politically compete with each other. Denis Hay told us in his book titled The Italian Renaissance in its Historical Background that it was the polity of the Italian states that acted as the stimulus for cultural changes. It resulted in a remarkable diversity of cultural and intellectual activities that was not seen in the rest of Europe. For centuries, the Italian merchants, particularly in Florence, possessed a large reservoir of liquid capital for investment. They possessed knowledge and expertise on capital investment that enabled them to reap maximum gains. 3 centuries of international trading, banking, and industry fostered what could be called a mercantile or bourgeois mentality. Hence, the cities in Italy provided a suitable climate for the Renaissance. Unlike the kind of segregation between the landed nobles and the urban merchants that existed in feudal Europe of North, the Italian landed classes were increasingly drawn into town life on equal terms with leading commercial industrial families. The nobles made their town house the center of their social life. There was virtually no major distinction between the aristocracy and the upper bourgeoisie. The amalgamation of these two important sections of the Italian nobility and leading commercial and industrial groups led to the formation of a relatively integrated civil society. By the early 16th century, what was expected of the noble or an aristocrat was best illustrated in the Book of the Courtier by Baldassare Castiglione. This book brings out those ideals which the great patron of the Renaissance tried to achieve. Boucard suggests that Castiglione's work is reflective of the merging of the upper and middle classes as a result of their living together in cities. Many historians believed that public support for culture first came in Italy by the middle of the 13th century. On the other hand, scholars like Robert S. Lopez and Carlo M. Cipolla question the link between economic prosperity and cultural progress. According to another explanation, the great princes such as Visconti and Sforza in Milan, the Medici in Florence, the Este in Ferrara, and the Gonzaga in Mantua made major contribution to the Renaissance by patronizing art and literature in their respective courts. Even the lesser aristocratic families made similar contribution, as did the popes in Rome. Popes Alexander VI, Julius II, and Leo X were popularly called the Renaissance popes because of their contribution to the field of art and architecture. From the mid-14th century, a conscious reaction started against the form and content of chivalrous poetry as well as scholastic learning of the Middle Ages. The Humanitas of Cicero provided the watchword for an education that claimed to free man from social conventions and the narrow-mindedness brought by professions. It is also argued by historians that the ruins of Roman Empire that existed around the city-states, particularly near Rome, drove the imagination of the Italians to recreate their past glory. There were many channels of Greek penetration into Italy. Venice had strong commercial links with the Byzantine Empire, but Greek knowledge also reached indirectly through a number of Greek envoys and fugitives such as Cardinal Bessario of Nicaca, who donated his library to the humanist scholars. The political rivalry among the Italian cities led to different intellectual reactions, as was the case in Florence. The intellectual reactions to these struggles proved extremely important. The intellectual climate in this era promoted discussions and led to the formation of fresh ideas on the question of city constitution and the nature of government. Individual artists, architects, and scholars generally depend on patrons for financial security. Earlier, artworks were commissioned by corporate bodies and by the church. This practice continued throughout the period of Renaissance. Along with this, another source of patronage developed in the form of individual bankers, merchant princes, and various groups interested in commissioning works of art. In the recent years, historians have emphasized or denied the role of patrons in setting the standard of art during the Renaissance and the role they played in the selection of themes. Peter Burke identifies three motivations behind this: pity, prestige, and pleasure. According to Vasari, sometimes even artisans, tailors, and members of craft guilds commissioned works of arts. This competition led to the employment of artists and architects within the Italian cities on a much larger scale than ever before. Earlier, very few artists were recruited from the lower middle class for major projects, but slowly individual genius gained recognition. Thus, we find that in the earlier period of Renaissance, patronage was dominated by urban public support because of the concentration of wealth in the cities and because of the popularity of Republican ideas. It would be wrong to suggest that religion had no part to play in the emergence of the Renaissance. Many of the gigantic buildings were the combination of piety, civic pride, and religious patronage. Hereafter, Renaissance flourished only in the courts of Italian rulers and in the papal courts. From the mid-15th century, the chief patrons of the Renaissance in many parts of Italy were wealthy individuals. The competitive spirit of Italian city-states was also revealed in the construction of chapels and basilicas with elaborate and beautiful ornamentation. At the same time, it must be remembered that the Renaissance was a cultural movement that was confined to the upper classes of society and was by no means democratic or popular. Its social base remained limited to the ruling elite. At the same time, the urban environment was an essential condition for the emergence of the Renaissance, and it could not have achieved the scale and magnitude it did in a rural or a feudal society. This is the end of our today's discussion. Please subscribe our channel, like our video, and comment. Listen to our podcast episodes. Follow our official Facebook page, Twitter handle, and Instagram. For any query, feel free to mail us. For details, see the description.